The lock on her office door clicked for the last time at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, and nobody was there to hear it. Diane Mercer stood in the hallway of the 42nd floor with a cardboard box pressed against her chest and a key card that no longer worked. The cleaning crew had already come and gone. The overnight security guard she'd passed in the lobby hadn't met her eyes. The building directory by the elevators still listed her name, Chief Executive Officer, Mercer Capital Group, but by end of business that day, facilities would send someone to update it with black adhesive tape. She had known it was coming. That was the worst part. She had sat across from the board for 3 hours on Friday afternoon, in the same boardroom where she had closed 47 deals over 11 years, and she had watched each of their faces go carefully neutral, the way faces do when a decision has already been made and the meeting is only ceremony. She had signed things. She had nodded. She had said, "I understand" 4 times. She understood nothing. The elevator took 42 floors to reach the lobby, and Diane spent every second of it staring at her own reflection in the brushed steel doors. 5,100 square feet of life inside a cardboard box. A framed photo of her standing on a dock in Muskoka, the summer she turned 40. A bottle of scotch she'd been given when the firm crossed $1 billion in assets under management. A plant she'd kept alive for 6 years through 3 office renovations. The plant was already wilting. She'd forgotten to water it the week everything started falling apart. Outside, November had arrived the way November always does in Toronto, without apology, all gray sky and wet pavement and wind off the lake that went straight through wool. Diane stood on Bay Street with her box and her plant and her 6-year track record of 17% average annual returns, and she hailed a cab. She had nowhere to be. The apartment she'd moved into was not the kind of apartment a woman like Diane Mercer was supposed to live in. It was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building in Leslieville, the kind of building where the buzzer panel had names written on masking tape, and the hallway smelled faintly of someone else's cooking every evening around 6. She'd taken it furnished, month to month, paying with a credit card because the legal fees had already begun. The scotch went on the counter. The plant went by the window, the framed photo she left in the box. She didn't put it up because she didn't recognize the woman in it anymore. The fraud hadn't been hers. That was the thing she kept having to remind herself of, in the same way you keep pressing on a bruise to confirm it still hurts. 3 members of her executive team, people she had hired, mentored, defended, had been running a parallel scheme for nearly 2 years, moving client funds through a series of numbered shell companies registered out of Alberta, bleeding the accounts slowly enough that the quarterly audits didn't catch it. When the OSC investigation began, her name was on every document because her name was on everything. She was the CEO. The buck stopped with Diane Mercer, whether she had known or not. She had not known. But I did not know is a very small boat in a very large storm. Her lawyers were good. Not good enough to stop the investigation, but good enough to clarify the boundary between liability and culpability, good enough to get her out in front of it, good enough that she would probably not face criminal charges. Probably. The civil exposure was another matter entirely. The firm's insurers had already sent letters. 3 institutional clients had filed complaints. Her personal assets, the Rosedale house, the investment accounts, the RSPs she'd spent 20 years building, were under review pending the outcome of proceedings that her lead counsel estimated would take 18 to 30 months to resolve. 18 to 30 months. She was 51 years old with a wilting plant and a month-to-month lease and 18 to 30 months. At night she lay on a mattress that belonged to someone else and listened to the building settle around her and made lists in her head of the people who had called. Her sister had called from Vancouver, and the conversation had lasted 11 minutes and ended with the words, "I'm sure it'll work out." 2 former colleagues had texted. Her assistant of 7 years, a woman named Patricia who had sent Diane's mother flowers when she died, had left a voicemail that Diane still had not been able to listen to all the way through. Most people said nothing. That was the thing about a scandal in finance. It wasn't like other kinds of disgrace where people leaned in to watch. People in her world simply became very busy, very quickly and unavailable for lunch. She understood that too. On the third Thursday of November, Diane walked to the coffee shop on Queen Street because the apartment was beginning to feel like a waiting room. She ordered a medium dark roast and sat at a two-person table by the window, with her phone face down and her hands wrapped around the paper cup, and told herself she would give it 30 minutes before she went back. The place was warm and it smelled like cinnamon, and it was full of people living ordinary lives, and Diane found that she could not stop watching them. At the table across from hers, a man was sitting with a little girl who couldn't have been older than 6. The girl had dark braids with plastic beads at the ends, and she was working very seriously on a drawing, her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth in concentration. The man was helping her, or trying to, gently correcting the way she held her crayon, but following her lead about what the drawing was supposed to be. There were papers spread across his side of the table that he kept glancing at. A folder, some kind of forms with fields at the top that Diane, from this angle, couldn't quite read. He looked tired in a specific way that Diane recognized. Not the tired that sleep fixes, but the tired that accumulates over months of solving problems you didn't cause. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't touched it. "Is that a whale?" he said, leaning over to look at the drawing. "It's a house," the girl said, in a tone that suggested this should have been obvious. "Right," he said. "Of course. I can see it now." The girl looked at him with great patience. "No, you can't." He laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that catches you, and the tiredness left his face for a moment, and then it came back. Diane looked away. She looked at her own hands. She had never had children. There had been a time in her late 30s when she had thought about it with some seriousness, had even gone so far as to have certain conversations with a man she'd been seeing for 2 years, a Crown attorney from Hamilton who had been kind and steady and largely incapable of understanding why she worked the way she worked. The relationship had ended without drama or specific grievance. Life had continued. The thinking had faded, replaced by other things, then more other things, until it was simply one of those roads she hadn't taken, and she had made a certain peace with that. Looking at the man across from her, the cold coffee, the little girl's beaded braids, that laugh, she felt something she couldn't name exactly. Not regret, something quieter, like standing outside a lit window in the dark. She picked up her phone, put it back down. She went home. His name, she would later learn, was James Okafor. He was 38 years old. He was a structural engineer who had worked for 8 years as a mid-level project coordinator at a firm called Vantage Infrastructure Partners, which was, as of 14 months ago, a firm at which he no longer worked. She had fired him. She hadn't known his name when she did it. That was one of the true things about her life that she had to sit with now, in the third-floor apartment in Leslieville, with the scotch on the counter and the wilting plant. She had signed off on a restructuring in the spring of the previous year, not at Mercer Capital directly, but at a portfolio company where she sat on the board and where the new efficiency targets had required a reduction in workforce. 22 positions. She had approved the list on a Tuesday. She had been on a flight to Calgary by noon. She had not known his name, but she had known, when she approved that list, that 22 people would go home that evening and tell someone what had happened. She had known it in the abstract as a fact, and she had set it aside as a fact because the targets were the targets and the board was the board, and the list had been prepared by people who were paid to prepare these things carefully. James Okafor had not been at work the day the notices went out. He had been at Sick Kids, 3 floors above a 6-year-old girl named Blythe, who had spent the previous 6 weeks in hospital with a diagnosis that had taken 3 different specialists to confirm and another 2 weeks to begin treating. He had taken leave, family emergency, documented, approved by his direct manager. He had been given permission to be absent. His notice was sent to his personal email while he was sitting in a hospital chair. He learned about the restructuring and about his daughter's treatment plan within 4 hours of each other. Diane did not know any of this when, 4 months later, she found herself standing in the foyer of a community center in the East End on a Wednesday night, holding a number on a slip of paper, waiting to speak to someone about emergency financial assistance. It was a program run through a network of local charities, and her lawyer had given her the information without commentary, which Diane had appreciated. There was nothing in the world she wanted less than commentary right now. The folding chairs were arranged in a horseshoe, and most of them were filled. A woman in her 70s with a walker, a young couple who weren't speaking to each other, a man in work boots with his steel toes worn silver who kept checking the door. Diane sat in the middle of it in her Eileen Fisher coat, which she was now aware was a conspicuous item of clothing, and she looked at the number on her slip of paper, 14, and she waited. The man from the coffee shop walked in at 7:10. She recognized him before he recognized her, which gave her a moment that she didn't know what to do with. He was wearing the same jacket he'd had at Queen Street, brown canvas fraying at the left cuff, and he was alone this time, without the little girl and her beaded braids. He took a number from the woman at the desk. He sat down across the horseshoe from Diane. He pulled out his phone. He looked up. The recognition moved across his face in stages. The coffee shop first. Then something else, something slower, like a page turning somewhere in the back of his mind. "You were at Queen Street," he said. "The Thursday place?" "Yes," Diane said. "Thought so." He looked back at his phone, then seemed to reconsider looking at his phone. "James," he said. "Diane." They shook hands across the horseshoe. It was an awkward reach. "First time here?" he asked. "Yes. They're good people," he said. "Slow, but good." He said it like someone who had been here before, which he had, twice. She wanted to ask about the little girl. She didn't ask about the little girl. They called her number before his, and she gathered her coat and her folder and her documents, and went behind the particle board partition to sit across a folding table from a woman named Susan, who had kind eyes and an efficient manner, and who took Diane's paperwork without blinking at the address in Rosedale that was no longer hers. Diane filled out what needed filling out. She left with a reference number and information about rental assistance programs, and the number of a legal clinic that might, Susan said gently, be able to supplement her existing counsel on a reduced fee basis. James was still waiting when she came back out. She stopped. "Good luck," she said. "You too," he said. Then, "It gets less strange." Coming here, after a while, she believed him, and she didn't know why, except that he said it like someone who meant it. She saw him again 6 weeks later in a way that had no coincidence to it at all. Diane had been following, from the controlled distance of her third-floor apartment, the slow and grinding progress of the investigation. The board had appointed an independent forensic auditor. The OSC had issued supplementary requests. Her lawyers had filed 2 motions, one of which had been partially successful. Through all of it, she had been trying, methodically, because methodical was the only way she knew how to be, to locate former colleagues who might be willing to provide statements in support of her position. Character witnesses, factual witnesses, people who had sat in rooms with her and could speak to what she had and hadn't known. Most had declined. Politely, carefully, with language that suggested they had also spoken to lawyers. She had been given, through a circuitous route she didn't fully understand, the name of a former contractor who had done structural reviews for one of the portfolio companies involved in the scheme. A man who had flagged irregularities in a project approval process and been dismissed from the contract early. He had filed a complaint at the time. The complaint had been routed, she later realized, to the same executive team that was running the scheme. It had gone nowhere. The contractor was James Okafor. She found his number through the community center worker who had been assigned to her case. She called on a Sunday afternoon. He picked up on the 3rd ring. The silence on his end when she said her name lasted long enough that she counted the seconds. 4 of them. "Vantage?" he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. Another silence. She heard in the background the specific high-pitched negotiation of a child who did not want to have a bath. "I need 10 minutes," she said, "or less. I just need to know if what you filed is something you'd be willing to speak to formally. In connection with the OSC investigation, you're asking me to help you." "I know what I'm asking," Blythe, he said, away from the phone. 2 more minutes, then bath, I mean it. Then back to her. I know who you are, Ms. Mercer. I looked you up. After the community center, I know. Then you know I know what happened to those 22 people. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. In the background, the child, Blythe, she now had a name, was singing something quietly to herself, the words not quite audible. I filed that complaint in good faith, he said finally, and it got buried, not by you, as far as I can tell, but by the people you hired, the people you trusted. A pause. I know what it's like to be undermined by people you trusted. Diane did not say anything. What I filed is documented, he said. I have copies. The complaint, the correspondence, the follow-up that never came. If a formal proceeding asks me to speak to that, I'll speak to it. Thank you, she said. The two words came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat. I want you to know the restructuring advantage. You don't have to do this, he said. I approved that list without reading it, she said. Not your specific file, not any of them. I'm not telling you that to defend it. I'm telling you because it's true, and because I think you've been owed the truth about it for a while. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. Not cold. Something more like the moment after a door opens. Bath time, he said, and she understood he was speaking to Blythe now. Then, back to her, I'll have my sister call you Monday to coordinate the documents. Thank you, James. Don't thank me yet, he said. Get some sleep, Ms. Mercer. You sound like you haven't. She had not. But that night, for the first time in 6 weeks, she did. The formal proceedings moved with all the velocity of continental drift. 3 months passed, then 4. The forensic audit produced a report. The report produced hearings. Diane testified for 2.5 days. Her lawyers described her testimony as credible and detailed. She described the experience as sitting inside her own worst nightmare while being asked to narrate it. James Okafor testified for an afternoon. She was not in the room for his testimony. Conflict protocols kept them separate. But her lead counsel, a woman named Isabeau Tremblay, who had the energy of someone who ran half marathons for enjoyment, told her afterward that he had been precise and patient and impossible to rattle on cross-examination. He's been roped in by complicated systems before, Isabeau said. He understands how to explain complexity clearly. He was good. He's a structural engineer, Diane said. It shows. In March, the OSC issued its findings. The 3 former executives, men she had promoted, whose salaries she had approved, whose work she had in one case publicly praised at an industry dinner 2 Novembers ago, were named in enforcement proceedings. The liability attributed to Diane was confined to deficiencies in oversight protocols. The language was careful and not exonerating exactly, but the distinction it drew was the distinction her lawyers had been working toward for 16 months. She was not criminally charged. The civil exposure was being resolved separately. It would take more time. There would be financial consequences. The Rosedale house was already sold, the equity redirected. The RSPs were partially restored. Her name was not clean, exactly. It would never quite be clean in the way it had been before, but it was no longer the name at the center of the thing. Isabeau called her on a Thursday morning to tell her, and Diane sat at the kitchen table in the apartment in Leslieville and held the phone against her ear and said, "Okay," several times in a row without managing much else. She looked at the plant by the window. She had repotted it sometime in January. It was fine now. She met James for coffee in April at a different place on Queen Street, one with better chairs. Blythe was not with him this time. She was, he said, at school, full-time school. She had gone back in February, 8 months after her discharge, and she was apparently running the kindergarten social scene with some efficiency. "She sounds like you," Diane said without thinking. He looked at her, amused. "She's 5. She's better than me at most things already." They talked for an hour, about the proceedings and about Vantage, and eventually about the complaint he had filed and what he'd hoped would happen and what had happened instead. He talked about it without bitterness, which she found remarkable, and said so. "I was bitter for a while," he said, "but bitter takes up a lot of space, and I didn't have a lot of space to spare." She understood that completely. He was working again, contract work, rebuilding his client base, which was slow but moving. She told him about the consulting work she'd been carefully starting to take on, the one former colleague who had called in February to ask if she'd look at a portfolio problem on a strictly informal basis, the way that one inquiry had quietly led to a second, and the second to a third. "It moves slowly," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Then it doesn't." She had brought something to the meeting, an envelope which she set on the table between them in a way that she hoped looked less formal than it felt. Inside was a check, not a blank one. A specific amount written carefully, representing what she had been able to calculate as the difference between his severance from Vantage, which had been minimal, because his notice period had been cut short, and what a proper termination package should have been, with interest at a rate her conscience had determined was appropriate. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. "This isn't a settlement," she said. "I don't have the legal authority to make one, and this isn't it. This is," she paused. "This is me not having another word for it." He picked up the envelope. He held it for a moment. "My lawyer is going to have something to say about this," he said. "Your lawyer would be right to." He tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket, a different jacket than the brown canvas one. She noticed, though she didn't say anything. "You know what I remember most about that day," he said. "At the community center." "What?" "You said good luck when you left. Like you meant it." He smiled, small and genuine. "Nobody says things like that and means them. I could tell you did." She didn't know what to do with that, so she picked up her coffee. "Good luck, James," she said. "Better than last time," he said. "You've got some color back." She laughed. The short, real kind, the kind that catches you. And outside the window, Queen Street moved in its ordinary April way, and the sun came through the glass at the angle it gets in the East End in spring, and for a moment everything was simply what it was. Two people in a coffee shop starting over, in a city that does not wait for you but will, if you're paying attention, offer you small doors. She was paying attention now.